Okay, Dave Olson, maybe do two or three more. It's a real rogues gallery of regulars here. Dave Olson says there was a time when it took millions of dollars and the backing of a major studio to get a movie made. Now anyone can scrape together $5,000 and walk out of a Best Buy with a couple of HD cameras, Bluetooth microphones, a mid-level Mac on which to insert special effects, thus starting their own movie studio. I see this as a good thing because Hollywood seems to be overrun with perverts. What do you think the movie industry will look like in 10 years? And how many more Harvey Weinstein type shoes are there to drop? Great question. I'm going to call this next firewall, which I hope to shoot tomorrow. Harvey is Hollywood. All of these people getting up on their hind legs and talking about Harvey Weinstein and how awful it is. First of all, I find it pretty, let's just say, unsettling that very powerful women knew about this and didn't say a word. It was a forgive the term, it's a Hollywood term, and I don't mean anything by it, but essentially it was a nobody. It was a nobody who stood up and made these charges. And then the floodgates opened and out it came because now there was social proof. It was okay to criticize Harvey Weinstein because he was already destroyed, and so you had nothing to lose by it. The most telling sentence in the whole Harvey Weinstein thing for me so far has been one of the ones in the very first or second story that was reported, and it was Ashley Judd. She was talking about how she was in a hotel room with Harvey Weinstein 20 years ago. And Harvey was making, William Goldman, thank you, Janine. And Harvey was making the advances on her. And she said, my thought was, how do I get out of this room as quickly as possible without alienating Harvey Weinstein? That's Hollywood. It's not how do I get out of this room as quickly as possible and report him to the police. How do I get out of this room as quickly as possible without alienating Harvey Weinstein? The career comes first. And there's an awful lot of I don't mean for a second to be putting the blame on the victims here, not by any means, but this torrent of indignation from Hollywood is embarrassing. There are so many people coming out talking about that they knew about this. It's an indictment of the entire system, the entire culture. These are the people that are educating our children. These are the people that are determining how to vote. And they're horrible people. And I've been saying this for a long time. They're interesting people, but they're horrible people. And I've just come off of several hours with people who aren't horrible people. And the people here in the Stratosphere Lounge, well, let's not get carried away. The fact is, though, they're terrible people. So the answer is, how many shoes are there left to drop? I don't know. How many shoes have you got? How long do you want to be here, and how high can you count? It's endemic. Jeremy had a number of meetings where he was simply shocked because he has a moral core at what was openly being said. You go to a meeting to pitch a script to top-level studio executives. There'll be 3 men in there and a woman, and they start talking about, what was her name? I can never remember her name. Jessica Biel. I guess I can remember her name. And they were talking about whether or not they would do her. And then the woman executive said, oh, yeah, definitely, I'd do her in a heartbeat. She had to say that because that's the handshake. That's the handshake. As Jeremy points out, if that had been any other business, the woman would have owned the business the next day because of the lawsuit that she would be able to bring successfully. The deals in Hollywood are paid for in flesh, and actors and actresses primarily, not exclusively, understand this. And one story I've heard that really set the stage, so to speak, for what we're dealing with is I remember a story about not a super famous actress, but a well-known actress, a name, and her assistant. She and her assistant got to be very close. It seemed like they were personal friends. And they ended up on location. Needless to say, when they go on location for the actress, they bring the assistant with them. And the actress started to sleep around with the director. And the assistant, naive little waif that she was, sat down with the actress and said, blank, I just hope you take this in the way I intended. It's just coming at you, not as a coworker, but as a friend. This is very bad. This is gonna jeopardize everything that you're doing. And the actress became enraged, and here's what she said. She said, "Don't you dare tell me how to run my career." So that's the second part of the question first. The first part of the question is more interesting, in my opinion, Dave. I don't want to retread too much of the ground that I've covered before, but there's good news and bad news. The world, the earth is changing. I can smell it in the air. I can taste it in the water. This show that you're watching now, the shows we produce here, this is the future. This is what it looks like. It's going to be a question of personal credibility and affinity and all the rest of it. The network news is going away, and all of it is going away, and we can watch it go away right in front of our eyes. Newsweek was sold. All these other magazines are sold. Rolling Stone's out of business. All of it. This is the future. And so there's good news and bad news here. The bad news is twofold, although it's the same phenomenon. The bad news is, since there's no longer, 20 million, 50 million eyeballs, Jeffrey Devlin, bless you. Steve Darrow just said that Jeffrey Devlin just joined BillWhittle.com. Jeffrey, thank you. Thank you very much. We will do our level best to spend that money as effectively as we can, and I will do my personal best to make sure we don't let you down, and see to it that you look back on that decision with happy thoughts. Thank you very much. Back to where I was. When Friends was on in the 90s, you could put together 20, 30 million eyeballs. That's a lot of eyeballs. It's a lot of purchasing power, so advertisers would pay money. And during the final year of Friends, every single one of the 6-person cast was getting $1 million an episode. Not a year, obviously. $1 million an episode, because you could put enough eyes on Friends to make it worth it. And as the networks gave way to cable stations, as we went from 3 channels to 40 channels, that pool of eyeballs split up, and you couldn't get them all in the same place anymore. And as that 40 channels broke up into essentially an infinite number of channels with internet programming and YouTube and user content, all the rest of it, it becomes tougher and tougher and tougher to put enough eyes in one place. In fact, it becomes virtually impossible to get enough people together in one place to make money from advertising. And so the only thing left is a membership model. It's the only thing that works. NPR's been doing the membership model for decades. But it's essentially saying that we don't have any way of controlling the content. I wouldn't limit it if I could. And essentially, just like NPR, I'm kind of on the honor system here, I'm just basically assuming that that I know for a certain fact that the people that are already members are doing it not so much for members-only programming or anything like that. And while I deeply appreciate the affection that I get from people, it's not, I don't think they do it specifically to help me out. They do it because they know that the messaging we do here is I think it's the best messaging in the world. And they, much more often than not, our membership says, "Bill, we know this is a members-only program. Please make this one public. It's important people to see it." So basically, there's a small group of people out of our total 50 million views on YouTube, let's say, that are paying for everybody else. They're paying for everybody else to watch it. So that's the deal. So again, this is all the bad news. It's difficult to do that. Now, the good news is, as you point out, the ability to make a movie has gone from millions of dollars to a few thousands of dollars, probably less than $10,000. Digital cameras, I shoot the firewalls, and I've been shooting the Nexus reports on a Blackmagic camera that costs less than $2,000, and it is 1080. It's what they shoot feature films on. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. The editing system is essentially it's a good Mac. It was a good Mac when I bought it in 2013, which means it's very obsolete by now, but it's perfectly fine. I'm very happy with it. That's perfect for the editing. I've seen Jonathan Hay over at Daily Wire did the special effects for the Arroyo. And he said, oh, we're going to have the back window of this truck get hit with bullets and shatter, and then we're going to do this. And I said, sure you are. He hadn't used the software yet. He'd never used it. He had to learn it. But by the time he was finished, the special effects in that movie were superb because he has talent, and it cost him $200 probably for After Effects or whatever. So the good news is you can do more and more and more at a very high level of quality at very little cost. So I've been saying this for 7, 8, 10 years now, and it becomes more relevant every day. On the occasions when people say, I want to be a writer, film writer, director or something, should I move to Los Angeles? I always have the same response for them. This is the last place you should be. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. It is the last place on earth you should be, especially if you're a conservative. Even if you're not, it's essentially a zero probability game. What I mean by that is this. If you come to Hollywood as a new scriptwriter and you've got a script that you just love, it's really terrific. And it is, let's say, it is in fact actually a terrific script. By far the most likely outcome for that script is not that it's going to get produced by somebody. By far the most likely outcome for that script is that somebody's going to make you an offer of probably high 5, low 6 figures to buy the script. You'll take it and be overjoyed, and it will sit on a shelf for the rest of time because the studio is not doing it to make it. The studio is buying your script not so that they can make it. They're buying your script so that someone else can't make it. This is exactly what happens. It may seem crazy to you, but I swear this is exactly what happens. Most of these sales are made specifically so that that film never gets produced. They don't want to, they for whatever reason, it's not one of the 10 or 12 or 5 movies that they're going to make that year, but they know it's a terrific script. They don't want anybody else to get it, so they basically buy it, and you get your, you get your food pellets, and that's a nice thing. Don't get me wrong. And for many writers, myself included, just any kind of a check is just astonishing. But that's basically what happens here, and that's for liberals and progressives. It comes down to connections. It comes down to any number of things, but the number of movies that are made compared to the number of scripts that are written is shocking. And it makes me wonder, I often wonder, how many unbelievable stories there are out there. Unbelievable stories that are never going to see the light of day. Either the script didn't get submitted, or it was put on the shelf, or it was, what was it, in turnaround? Turnaround means we're going to kind of produce it, and then, we decided not to. That's the end of the world. It's over. So this is the worst place for you to be. If somebody said to me, how do I make a movie? I would say, where do you live? And if they said, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, I would say, well, then I would put together a budget and a business plan, and I would find the 3 biggest car dealers in Nashville, Tennessee, and I would show them what it costs to make a movie and how much movies make. And my entire pitch would be this. I can make a movie of the same quality as a $30 million movie, but I can make it for $800,000. And so we don't have to make $30 million to make a profit. If this film makes $20 million, the $30 million film is a terrible loss. If it makes $20 million for us, we've done more than 20 times your initial investment. That's where I would go with it, and that's where I plan to go with it. So, T-Dog is saying Paranormal Activity was made for $15,000 and made $193 million. Blair Witch was $60,000 and made $250 million. Now, these are exceptions, no question. But since you asked this kind of in-the-weeds question, let me rephrase that, inside baseball question, Dave, the secret now is to keep the negative costs low. The only way to make a small movie successfully these days is to make as shallow a hole as possible that you have to dig out from. And again, if you can get it in theaters And it's worth it buying theater, just four-wall it. Just buy the screen time so that you can say it ran in theaters. If it ran in theaters, it puts it in a different category than direct to video. It puts it in a higher category. Even if you buy a theater and you show it in Abilene. If you have a film and the film is good enough, even if it's not good enough, with worldwide distribution and everything else, you can be pretty sure that even if it's essentially just blank leader with an NTSC tone on it, you're probably going to make back $700,000-800,000 worldwide in foreign rentals as well as the domestic and DVD market, Apple, iTunes, and Amazon, and all the rest. At least that. So the question is, can you make the movie inexpensively? Because if you can, then a catastrophic return is still a bit of a profit. And if the film has any kind of magic at all, now you're starting to talk about, real opportunity, real money. It doesn't have to be Paranormal Activity, especially if it costs $15,000 or $20 or whatever. I'd buy the gear, and I don't know. This is just the general speech to those of you that may be interested in this recipe for the destruction of your life. But if we learn by doing, and all of the things I learned as a director, I learned from editing. I learned from being in an editing room and saying, I need to go from this shot to this shot. I have to have a cutaway, and I don't have it. It's just not here. And I needed to do this, or that car is traveling in the wrong direction, or whatever. You make your mistakes out there in the field, but you learn what those mistakes are in the editing room. With that said, I was a theater major, and I remember very clearly sitting, rehearsing upstairs in Constance Theater lobby, just a big open lobby, after hours, nobody up there. I remember rehearsing in there. I remember rehearsing in black boxes. I remember rehearsing in various classrooms and so on. And I remember being able to tell very, very clearly, whether the actors I was working with were good or not. You may think that sounds kind of obvious, but sometimes it's not. Some people don't. They can't tell the difference. By the way, interesting point here. Eric Blake says David Mamet, we should do an entire Stratosphere Lounge on David Mamet alone, said that the best thing for wannabe screenwriters is to be a writer-director. He's absolutely right. What Mamet is basically saying is it's easier to raise money than it is to sell a script. That's it in a nutshell, actually. I don't have to say anything more than that. It's really pretty much it. It is easier to raise money than it is to sell a script. And given what I said about them putting your script on the shelf for the rest of time, it also means that as a director, it's going to get made. Now, I wouldn't start directing a feature film unless you knew what you were doing. I had done a number of small films before my first feature film, but I had nothing like enough experience. It was a catastrophe. But you not only, if you raise the money and you wrote a script, then you're going to get the story made and you're going to direct it. So that not only means it doesn't sit on the shelf, it also means that it doesn't have to go through another kind of living hell. And the living hell can best be described this way. You write a very moving story about a soldier who comes back and experiences all kinds of PTSD, and through getting together with his former comrades and facing the horrors of war, he's able to finally pull himself out of this hole of depression and reach a point where he's not only able to get married and live a happy life, but is also able to help his fellow warriors make the readjustment to come home. And you write that script and it's beautiful. And then the person who's bought it decides they're going to add a talking dog to this story. That the whole thing would be much more interesting if there was a talking dog that talked in kind of a funny voice. And that would be the dog that would narrate the script. See? It's brilliant, isn't it? Not kidding about the talking dog. Producers are a breed apart. There are many filmmakers who make great producers, but people who are exclusively producers, I think a very small percentage of them know what they're doing. First of all, there's a large number of them, and an almost uncountable number of them that are essentially Harvey Weinstein. They're movie producers just so they can use it as leverage to get in the sack. But when the talking dog issue comes up, that's not even really a producer. What we're really talking about there is network or studio. You get network notes or studio notes, or network input or studio input. Now we're talking about extremely stupid people, middle management people who are getting an outrageous sum of money. So if I write a TV show or something and I submit it to NBC, I'm talking about 15, 20 years ago, back when I knew what I was doing, when the business is changing so fast, as we just said. But I might write a really great script and send it in, and it will come back with network or studio fingerprints on it. And that means that some woman, let's say, who's making $230,000 a year to be the vice president in terms of development has to touch this. Because if she doesn't touch it and change it, then people are going to start asking, what are we paying her for? And so now, what was once a real work of art becomes this. It becomes the talking dog version of your really interesting story. And this is a special form of hell. It really is. I've had a bit of an experience with it, but it's a special form of hell to watch people take something that's very good and make it worse. That I actually have had a fair amount of experience with in the edit room. I've had experiences with some producers who make changes, and I look at it and I'm reluctant to make changes because I've got it the way I wanted to, and I look at the changes and said, this is actually much better. But that's unusual. Most of the time when I was doing Sunday Morning Shootout, and I just checked IMDb on that a couple days ago, I think we did 194 episodes over 5 years, and of the 194 episodes, I cut 190 of them. I didn't do the last 4 because I started at PJTV. But of that 190 shows that I edited, virtually all of the notes I got made the show worse. And in some cases, they made it much worse. And I say that objectively. I'm not saying they made it worse because it was my work that got changed. I'm saying they made it worse because people were making artistic decisions, and they're not artists. They're not writers. They're not directors. They have no training. They have no experience. They're simply middle management people who've managed to glad hand their way into an executive position in a studio or a network, and their job is to make changes to good content. That's the deal. You don't have to do with any of that. Go find some car dealers in wherever you are. Don't lie to them, because you can make a pretty decent case if you can keep the budget small. The short form of this 20-minute answer is, if you can keep the budget low enough, which is possible these days with the technology being as good as it is and as inexpensive as it is, you can make a good movie, but you got to be a good writer, you've got to be a good director, and you have to find good actors. And for God's sakes, find a good sound man, because bad sound is the single thing that makes a movie just seem cheap. I was sitting with my wonderful wife, who I miss very much and who I'm going to be going home to in just a few moments. And we were watching The Mummy, the Tom Cruise Mummy. And 30 seconds into that movie, you knew you were in trouble. And 2 minutes into the movie, you knew you were in big trouble. And after we watched this appallingly bad movie, we sat down and started talking about what's the difference between a good movie and a bad movie. Why does a movie look good and another movie look bad? And she's the best photographer I've ever seen. I think she's the best photographer in the world. One of the things that we talked about very quickly was the way the film is shot. And I can give you just a happy little pocket guide to experience here. But essentially, the reason that real movies, look like movies, and again, no offense intended, why Hollywood movies look like real movies and why church movies look like church movies, is because in Hollywood, the directors of photography understand that it's all about the focal plane. That's a pretty simple thing to say, but it's really that simple. It's all about the focal plane. Not the framing is important, camera placement is important, movement, all of that, but it's essentially the focal plane. Amateur films have everything in focus. I'm in focus. The wallpaper print 20 feet behind me is in focus. And we look at this at a flat screen, so the audience is focusing on a flat screen, And on this flat screen, things that are far away are in focus and things that are up close are in focus. And we don't notice it. It's completely subconscious for us. But that's not how we see the world. If you look at anything around you, just look around your room, you will see that what you're looking at is in focus and everything else around it is not in focus. And the further away you get from that thing, the further out of focus it is. And Hollywood professionals understand that you have to shoot a movie so that only the thing that you want people to see is in focus. You look at a great movie and the background is out of focus, but the actor is in very sharp focus and it pulls them out. Lighting can do that too. Pull people out. That's why shooting against a blank wall is the worst thing you could possibly do. It's like cell animation. It's like your character is just a cutout from the daisy pattern on the wall. We don't have 3D, not yet anyway, not consistently or commonly. And so lighting can pull things out. You keep the background dark or you light the person in the foreground. Very rarely you could keep the background bright and dark in the foreground where the person is. Dave Wellman wants to know what I mean when I say church movies. I mean things like God Isn't Dead, which I thought was a pretty good movie, but it looked like a church movie. Churches have been putting in hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of dollars, to get conservative religious films made, and that was what I meant by that. I didn't mean anything disparaging to it. God bless them for doing it, and every little bit helps. But most of them look so amateur that I think they actually hurt the cause more than help it. So little things like that. Little things like I'm not nearly as up on the sound as I am on the picture, but there are two things that you might find interesting about sound. One of them is, even if you're in a multi-millionaire's, a scene is set in a multi-million-dollar bedroom, and let's say you've got a slasher horror film. When the person strikes, more often than not, the editor will put in, completely unnoticed by your brain, but absolutely noticed by the base of your spine, they'll put in the sound of snapping twigs and grass rustling. Because we're coded biologically to hear a twig snap gets our attention. And that's hardwired. That's not something we learn. It's just hardwired into our survival mechanisms. So they will put things like that in and scare the bejesus out of you, and you don't even know why. That's actual art. That's the art form of filmmaking. That's superb quality work. You went to the movie to get scared, and they're using everything they know how to do to scare you. That's fantastic. 100% terrific. Another thing that they can do is they can put in a tone. This is not subliminal advertising or subliminal messaging, but it's close. Oftentimes, you'll find scenes that are trying to build suspense. There's the presence of a low tone. And it has the effect of making you uncomfortable. It's not something you can even identify. You don't even hear it, but it's there, and it's winding you up. And all of this, and since we're on the film subject, I will close the show with this because I love talking about movies. I don't get to do it often enough. I think you could make a pretty decent case that the only reason we know the name Steven Spielberg is because the shark broke. I really think you could make a pretty compelling case that no one would ever have heard of Steven Spielberg if the mechanical shark in Jaws worked the way it was supposed to. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if the shark had worked the way it was supposed to, the shark would have been in a lot of shots. And if you remember the shot where Quint is eaten at the back end of the orca, you can see the mechanical shark, and you can see the sides of it are made out of pretty thin plastic, and the biting is mechanical. It's not a very convincing shark. And if the shark was working the way it was supposed to, then Spielberg would have used that shark in a lot of shots. But luckily for Spielberg, and this is not to say that Spielberg doesn't have talent, he has enormous talent, he has monumental talent. But luckily for him, the shark didn't work. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that since he had a movie, I forget what the budget of Jaws was. It's small, but it's, $7 million or 12 or something. It's a decent budget for those days. Jaws was the first of the mega hits. It was the first of the blockbuster hits ever. I remember it very clearly. It was his first movie that I can remember that was a social phenomenon. I suppose Gone with the Wind would qualify, but honestly, Jaws changed the entire world in filmmaking in general, and so did Spielberg. But here's the point. Because the shark didn't work, Spielberg had to sit down and say to himself, basically, I've taken $10 million of other people's money in order to produce a shark movie, and I don't have a shark for my shark movie. And that's a bit of a problem. So, being the talented individual that he is, they had to improvise. And what Spielberg did as a result of not having the shark working was he had to suggest the shark. He had to suggest that the shark was there without showing the shark. And I don't know if he was aware of it at the time. I suspect not. But in retrospect, that was why that movie worked so well, was because you saw the shark so infrequently. And the reason that Jaws is so terrifying is that 90% of the movie, that shark is in your imagination. You don't see it. And because you don't see it, you don't get that sense of, oh, it's a mechanical shark. And of all the things I've ever seen in filmmaking, I have to say, I really do think the most effective piece of improvisation I've ever seen, in fact, one of the most effective pieces of filmmaking I've ever seen, was in Jaws, where they're telling the stories and Quintus talking about being on board the Indianapolis. And then you're outside in the water and you see the fishing boat off in the distance, and then boom, 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 these three enormous barrels that they've put into the shark come to the surface. It's terrifying, and there's nothing there. If you think about the opening scene in Jaws, where the girl is attacked, I went in to see that movie. I was a young kid. Was 77 maybe, something like that. So I would have been 17, 18, somewhere in there. And that opening scene where the girl is attacked, she's supposed to be eaten by a shark, and you're supposed to see it, but he never showed it to you. You just saw her swimming along, and then there's this alarmed look, and then she's pulled under and she's dragged through the water, and then she's absolutely terrified and stunned, and she disappears, and they don't show you the shark, and they don't show you any blood. It's nighttime, it's pitch black, but it is horrifying. And that's why Spielberg is the genius that he is. But I still maintain if the shark was working, that we wouldn't have heard of that movie. It would have just looked, okay, it's all right, I guess. The ability to put that in your mind is what made it work. And also, I haven't seen Paranormal Activity, but Blair Witch is a perfect example of this. The Blair Witch Project worked because they had excellent actors and because they didn't have a Blair Witch. If they'd had a Blair Witch, the movie would have failed. And if the actors hadn't been as good as they were, the movie wouldn't fail. Because the reason, and I like Blair Witch Project very much, but Blair Witch Project scared the daylights out of me. Just scared the hell out of me. And the reason Blair Witch Project scared the hell out of me was because they never showed the witch. But the people, I'm looking at the screen and I don't see the witch, but I'm looking at somebody who does see the witch, and that person is terrified, and that makes me terrified. Yes, 1975. Thanks, Dave. So I was probably, 15, something like that. That's the genius of the Blair Witch Project. You see little things that are very disturbing. The little wooden dolls that are hanging in the forest are alarming. And certainly by the time they unwrap that little package, you've got a guy screaming off camera during the night. And they unroll that little package and you see human teeth in there. And that sends you just into orbit. You don't have to see the witch. The creature's always just out of frame. And when you see her in the tent And all of a sudden, there's this a giant attack on the outside of the tent. I just leapt out of my chair. I just scared the daylights out of me, because I had the same sense that they did. There's something out there and I can't see it. But when I see the look on their face, it's great. And when I say you have to have great actors, I don't remember any of them ever doing anything else. But the girl in that, the iconic image of the Blair Witch Project, is her in the tent. She's got the knitted cap on. She's lighting herself from underneath, and she's doing recording into the camera, talking about how scared she is, and I bought it. She looks terrified, and her breathing and her sobbing and everything. She looks terrified, and she's seen the witch. So I didn't have to see the witch. I could see what the witch was doing to people. And the ending, the final shot, the whole thing in the house at the end was really spooky and eerie. But to be honest with you, that final shot just to this day just makes me... It was so perfectly set up. It was so perfectly set up. I don't think I've given anything away, Dave. It's all in the mind. It's theater of the mind, and it was beautifully written and magnificently acted, and very, very scary, especially for a movie that, that has a villain that lives in your head. Those are the scary ones, and people who can harness that are the people who are geniuses. If you've seen Psycho, everybody talks about the shower scene in Psycho where Janet Leigh is stabbed to death. Now that is a spoiler. And I've seen that sequence many times. It is probably the single greatest sequence in all of movies. But might surprise you to know that in that horrific scene where you watch this woman being stabbed to death repeatedly in the shower, there's not a shot in that montage where you ever see a knife touch the skin. It never happens. You are so convinced of what's happening, but there's not a shot in there where you see a knife actually touching skin. You see the knife being raised, you see the knife falling, you see blood in the water, you see Janet Leigh's expression, you see her fighting things off, but the knife never touches her, ever. And it is horrific. It's terrifying. Nice little piece of film trivia, by the way, is that the blood in the sink, it's a black and white movie. They tried using stage blood, and it just didn't look right. It looked kind of beige or tan or something. I think they had to use India ink. It's either India ink or Hershey syrup, but it was something like that. I'm pretty sure it was black ink. And you just see this black ink, which is blood in a black and white movie, just circling the drain, and it's horrible. It's horrible. And it's magnificent, is what it is. It's just magnificent. It's genius. And it's the power of this medium and the people that control, and the music. Good, well said, Sarge. The music. It's Bernard Herrmann, I think. I think so. That shrieking, reek, 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 reek. It's the sound of a knife cutting through the air. It's the sound of a knife, stabbing a beautiful woman. That's what it sounds like. And Ohio Coastie points out that now needless to say, this is a very interesting little story. I'm elaborating a little bit on what he wrote here in the comment section, but so Janet Leigh is the woman who's murdered in the shower, and she does the shower scene. I don't know how long it took. I'll bet it took him 2 days to shoot that. So basically, it was chocolate syrup. Thanks, T-Dog. Chocolate sauce. So Janet Leigh is standing around for 2 days, bored out of her wits, because it's taking 2 days to shoot a scene that lasts, somebody can tell me the exact number, 23 seconds, something like that. She's bored out of her mind, and she's wet, and she's cold, and she's miserable, and she's as far, I'm talking about the actress now, she's as far from being scared as she possibly could be. She's just plain bored and sick of it, and knows every shot set up because she was there for all of them. When she saw the movie, she was so frightened that she never took a shower again. She presumably took a bath, but she never, ever got back in the shower again. She was so scared by what Hitchcock had done. And if there's one person on the planet who should be immune to being afraid of that shower scene, it's Janet Leigh. Janet Leigh and Anthony Perkins. Because they're the only two people, really, plus Hitchcock, of the names that we know. There are obviously other crew members there. But they're the only two people that know that that 20-second montage or whatever it was just a simple case of, okay, Anthony, let's try it again. A little more violent, please. A little longer between the that's good. Good. Okay, now let's do it again. And this is how it works on the set. The two people who should be absolutely immunized against any fear whatsoever from Psycho are the actors that were in it. But one of the actors was so scared by the art form, just the power of the movie, that she never took a shower again. A lot of people saw Jaws, they never went in the water again. I went out on Biscayne Bay sailing, I think the day after I saw Jaws 2, and I was swimming in the bay, and I looked up and, I don't know, 15 yards away from me, I saw this fin just go through the water like that and back under, and I was motivated. Turns out it was a dolphin, which is a pleasant surprise. But many people suspect that only the Christ was able to walk on water, and I'm here to tell you, if you're sufficiently scared, you have a pretty good chance of doing it as well. You move very fast. All right, I think that'll do it. I want to go home.